I think affirmative action is a set of policies, a set of interventions, even a set of dreams, if you wish, that different societies have designed for themselves in different ways.
Global affirmative action in a neoliberal age was inspired by the need to draw lessons from a cross-cultural set of examples about dilemmas that we face in the United States. This conference was jointly hosted by the University of Malaya and the Center for African and African American Research at Duke University, with the intention to recognize that the experiences of different nations have equal value in our understanding of the politics and history of affirmative action across the globe. We drew scholars representing all of these places together to talk about the diverse circumstances that inspired affirmative action, the policies that have been instituted and how they have changed over time to redress these situations, the ethical dilemmas, and the intended and unintended outcomes of these policies.
How is this a sustainable model that leads into, it seems to be, a Western, a neoliberal form of development?
So these are important issues I think we need to consider. The issue of power, the nature of the state, the evolution of the state. And in that process, what happens to affirmative action?
We can't really talk about affirmative action in the absence of recognizing that there are processes of discrimination that excluded the populations or communities that were targeted for affirmative action.
Affirmative action can only exist where a social system produces vulnerability. If there were no racism, no sexism, you don't need affirmative action. You just don't.
The Indian Constitution is committed to the principle of universal equal citizenship. Every citizen is equal to every other. But it was felt, widely felt at the time, that unless special provisions are made for groups that have suffered discrimination and disadvantage for centuries in India, even if this requires a departure from the principle of strict equality, these departures are necessary in order to make India into a truly equal society.
In affirmative action resides an accusation. It is that there has been some kind of exploitation, discrimination in the past. The result of this exploitation and discrimination and subjugation has been that in the present, those who have been suffering from that condition are not really on par and ready to compete with the regular citizen in the marketplace.
The global nature of affirmative action also includes recognition that the United States was not the first country to adopt such a policy, or a policy that looks like what we have attempted to do.
The first country to introduce affirmative action in the world was India, and it was introduced to alleviate the plight of minority groups that had long been marginalized.
The founding fathers of our Constitution decided that for a more robust form of equality in the longer run, we needed, at least in the short run, to make these special provisions. And these special provisions took the form of quotas, which are roughly in correspondence with the proportion of these groups, the percentage of these groups in our population.
The second country to introduce it was the United States, who also introduced it to help Afro-Americans who had been long marginalized in this society.
American affirmative action at the federal level really doesn't get implemented until about 1971 or so under the Nixon administration.
Malaysia was the third country to introduce affirmative action in a major way. But the difference between Malaysia and the US and India is that while affirmative action in India and the US was for minorities. In Malaysia, affirmative action was for the majority group. This was a fundamental difference. And later, other countries would follow the Malaysian model. Countries such as Fiji and South Africa would look to Malaysia and adopt a policy in the sense that it was for the majority community in these countries.
It was perceived by the British in the 1800s, after Fiji became a British colony in 1874, that there was a need to progress Fijians through the economic system so that they can be on par with other ethnic groups.
In the context of Northern Ireland, I think it's important to situate it in the context of inequality in that society since the formation of Northern Ireland in the early 1920s.
So the circumstances from which affirmative action policies emerged in South Africa is a colonial and an apartheid history. It means that the majority of the population, considered black, were in fact excluded from citizenship and excluded from a whole range of basic services like decent education, housing, water, electricity. Basic stuff.
And that history entails the rise of colonial rule. The British occupied Malaysia in the late 1800s and ruled for over 100 years. And during that period of time, what happened was the indigenous community, the Malays, were deeply marginalized from mainstream capitalist economy.
Brazil is the largest population of African-descended peoples in the New World, because 50% of the 200 million people in Brazil are of African descent. It's the country that first introduced plantation slavery, the importation of African slaves, and a society that is profoundly unequal, both socioeconomic bases and also racial bases, while at the same time having a self-representation of itself and understanding of itself as being a society that, since it didn't have segregation, is not a society that is racist like the US, that it's a society of racial democracy.
I turned 30 in that year, and that was the first time in my life that I voted. It was such a powerful experience, and voting meant something far more than just going to tick a box. It meant, that I was part of the decision about my future and everyone else's future in the country.
So affirmative action sort of is born in a state sense in that moment with the new Constitution. The Constitution names affirmative action along with the problem of racism, the need for reparation, and the problem of colonialism as sort of all intertwined. It requires the state to do affirmative action measures, but it also argues that the notion of state and society has to change. That in other words, it isn't just to include minorities in a situation where historically minorities have been excluded, but rather rethink society and state along a whole different level of things. One, for example, is to recognize what are called ancestral peoples and ancestral knowledges. It names a different kind of state. So it talks about a plurinational state and an intercultural state. It names nature as the subject of rights. And it talks about a different notion of a social project, of a way to think about society based on the notion of collective well-being, or living in plenitude of all beings.
One additional difference between a country like the US and a country like Colombia is that in the US, the emphasis is on equality, on equal opportunities, equal rights, and so forth, and that's important. But in a country like Colombia, the emphasis is both on equality and difference. So many of these movements are demanding to be able to maintain their own worldviews, their own practices, their own ways of being.
We tend to distinguish between affirmative action and equity, because affirmative action is seen in South Africa as a North American term, which is about addressing inequalities in the present without necessarily a focus on the historical legacy of the ways in which these inequalities in the present have been created over time.
The performance of affirmative action has been mixed, with some successes and a good deal of failure.
Where it's worked very well has been on the question of the presence of women, particularly white women, in terms of the United States, in countries such as India, in terms of the women who represent the upper classes or whoever is the dominating group. Places such as South Africa, again, within whoever represents the women in the dominant groups, there has been a real change in terms of affirmative action. So that has worked very well.
These laws have mainly benefited people like me. I was part of a group of people who were racially classified as colored, and we had what, some people would call partial citizenship. In relation to the majority of people in South Africa, I was relatively privileged, if you were to think about it. Okay? Not as privileged as white citizens of apartheid, because I was not a citizen, nor were my parents, but there were these gradations of citizenship, if you like.
What hasn't worked, of course, has been the question of those who are not in the dominating group, particularly in terms of males who represent the most subordinated populations. And one of the complicated things about how it works with women that is hard to explain is that usually in communities where there is something such as racism, or there is a certain dynamic that sets up a certain group of people as in some way dangerous, that sense of being dangerous tends to converge around males. So the big problem is, even where there's an effort to bring in, say, black men into the framework of many institutions, the social conditions that construct black men as dangerous make it very difficult for affirmative action to work. Although affirmative action has been advanced in many places, it has been done in bad faith. It's because affirmative action in many ways puts a society on trial. To have affirmative action is to say something is wrong with a society. But many people don't like to say there's something wrong with their society, so they'll defend it by saying the society is fine, there's something wrong with the people who are trying to be incorporated into the society. So we find a lot of pathologizing of excluded peoples.
The notion of presumed inferiority is found all over the world. The United States is not terribly unique in the forms of inequality that prevail here.
If one were to walk into a university that historically has been the space of people considered white, and in South Africa, a minority, even though you are part of the majority, you walk into a space which is occupied by a dominant minority, and you as the majority person are presumed to be inferior simply by your visual presence, not at all based on data. So before you even speak, you are presumed to be inferior.
The president of Brazil from 2002 to 2008, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, talks about the prejudice of the people who live in the big house, the slave master's house, versus the people who live in the slave quarters. But what he really is most interested in is the fact that the sense of inferiority is internalized by black people, by women, who believe that just because they're black, or just because they don't have education, or just because they're a woman, that they're not capable of it. And that the struggle is a struggle against the prejudice of the larger society that you yourself have internalized.
The assumption is that the Fijians are inferior in terms of not only economics, but also educationally and intellectually. So affirmative action was a means by which you tried to make up for that presumed inferiority.
And that's exactly what the whole affirmative action and many of these other policies are about, is about being able to stand up and say, I'm a full human being, I'm not inferior, I have rights, somebody like me has reached the very top of Brazilian society, which shows that we are not what you say we are.
There has been substantial opposition to affirmative action in virtually all the countries where it's been implemented. Some of the major arguments that are generally made against affirmative action are arguments like the idea that it puts unqualified people in positions that they don't deserve to hold, that it reduces productivity in a country, that if you were going to have affirmative action at all, then your target should be based upon people's socioeconomic position rather than their race or their ethnicity.
The person who is the recipient of affirmative action is not asked to have the same level of qualification as the ordinary citizen. Now, a lot of people don't like this. They don't like the idea of giving somebody something for an unmerited kind of reward. It smacks of reverse discrimination.
Affirmative action actually did something the opposite of what a lot of people claim affirmative action has done. And what I mean by that is this. If you look at how affirmative action has been demonized in a lot of the world, it's often presented with disparaging language as lowering standards, bringing on the qualified people, that sort of a thing. But it's a completely false narrative. Affirmative action actually raised the standards. It actually created a situation of accountability. Prior to the question of the inclusion of excluded groups, there weren't actually high standards. In fact, in some cases, there were no standards at all because there was a more buddy system, there was more questions of loyalty. Most institutions didn't even rely on excellence. They relied on an average level of competent performance. However, once the question of excluded groups was raised, these institutions had to account for themselves. And so they created a fictional narrative of these past high standards. And in fact, as they scrambled to find the standards, this is where the tricky issue comes in. Because the purpose of them finding these standards was to justify exclusion itself. That meant then the standards were already being constructed in a way that was meant to legitimate the exclusion of the groups who were to come in. In effect then, we made a move from an absence of standards to racist standards or sexist standards. When they enter these places where they imagine these high standards there to meet, they found out that the previous emperors simply had no clothes.
With, this attempt to begin to achieve equality in South Africa, tensions have clearly emerged between the minority of the population, historically classified white, and who had full substantive citizenship in the context of apartheid, and a majority of people historically classified black. And Mr. Walker's point of contestation was that he was being racially discriminated against because he had to pay a metered rate and the black people in the township areas were paying a flat rate, which was generally lower. And he wanted, compensation for that. And what Mr. Walker was saying is that I am being discriminated against on the basis of race because I have to pay more for my water than poorer people in the township next door. That was, for me, a very important way in which a person who is a minority, but a dominant minority, begins to take on a victim position, despite the fact that their material conditions have in fact not deteriorated. And yet, he had the wherewithal, if you like, to take this issue to court as a matter of racial discrimination against him as a white person. He couldn't, conceptualize that his well-being and the level of his well-being was for all these years at the expense of the well-being of poorer people, black people in the townships not too far away from where he lived.
Most part of the contestation of affirmative action wasn't really articulated in terms of exclusion of white Brazilians, but it was talked about in two ways. On the one hand, they were saying that Brazil was importing the American way of understanding race and creating racial divisions where they don't exist. And then on the other hand, which is tied to it, that in doing so, the Brazilian government was risking to construct a society that would look like Rwanda or South Africa under apartheid. They were saying that affirmative action would actually bring about racial violence. And both effects are totally against the Brazilian national identity, which celebrates miscegenation and racial harmony. You don't need racial divisions, different groups, racial groups, for racial violence to take place. But you don't need segregation for racial violence to exist.
In 1990, the then government decided to expand the quota regime to extend quotas to a set of caste groups who had not been part of the quota regime before that. That was the time that saw the greatest division and polarization of Indian society on this issue. There were several young people who actually committed suicide in public, a phenomenon that is called self-immolation, setting themselves on fire. They felt that there were scarce enough places in university, in government employment, and they felt that if the opportunities diminished for themselves, it would be somehow a compromise of the principle of merit. Merit in society is frequently a result of historical advantage, so that those that we consider meritorious have also had more opportunities themselves, perhaps even their parents and their grandparents' generations. And so merit is actually a summation of all of these many advantages which are mostly inherited. It's not just about IQ.
So the Fisher case brought by a young woman whose last name is Fisher against the University of Texas system in opposition to what is called their 10% rule. One of the strategies that was taken in the interest of maintaining what is typically called diversity was to introduce what's known now as the 10% rule, so that any student in the state of Texas public school system who finishes in the top 10% of their graduating class at a public school in the state will be eligible for admission to one of the University of Texas system schools. Fisher argues that there were students who were admitted under the 10% rule from schools that might have a lower overall academic performance. And there were students who were admitted from the 10% group who had lower academic performances than she had. So she's arguing that the 10% rule is inequitable and unfair to people like her. So she's brought a case that's made its way to the Supreme Court. It's interesting, in all of these instances where students say that they were kept out of an institution because of the operation of some sort of mechanism that's supposed to be inclusive of those who have previously been deprived access, I'm never sure how they know who specifically got in that prevented them from getting in. I mean, admissions processes don't usually work that way, but nevertheless, this is the argument that's been made. I think affirmative action has worked haltingly, in part because it has never been implemented intensively in the United States. It's been implemented inconsistently. I'm pessimistic about the fate of affirmative action. I actually think that the Supreme Court will move through the Fisher decision and perhaps through others to essentially eliminate the application of affirmative action in the United States, at least as we knew it.
Now, certain kinds of ideologies, like capitalism, stress the significance of the market. The market is supposed to be merit-oriented, and everybody must submit himself or herself through competition, market competition. And that competition is based on, presumably, on merit. Now, when you have neoliberalism, it means to say the entire economy is organized around competition. It really is a doctrine that says that the state only needs to be concerned with law and order and defense. And the whole area of social activities, roads, education, health, all of these social services, in the neoliberal lexicon, these things need not be carried out by the state. In the utopian condition of the neoliberal world, you have a very slender state.
In 1991, India moved towards the liberalization of its economy. Some people would call this neoliberalism. Business got a boost. So earlier we had a regime which was not strictly speaking socialist, but the state played a large role in the economy. Now, after the reforms, private business got more opportunities to evolve, to develop, and to consolidate and strengthen themselves. The quota regime, you would expect that with principles of meritocracy and marketization in the economy, there would be less scope for quotas. But actually speaking, the opposite happened.
There's a big battle around the ideology of the market and neoliberalism, that all this stuff, right, all this equality and affirmative action stuff gets in the way of achieving market efficiency, of achieving investment, of achieving economic development. That's not a glib comment. There are really some quite intriguing, fascinating and strong debates between equality lawyers, human rights lawyers and international economic lawyers about all this.
I would argue that if anything, affirmative action actually increases or moves you closer to having more meritocratic arrangements, because you are no longer excluding people who have talent and motivation and skills. You're now including them if affirmative action works correctly. And so as a consequence, you're actually improving the quality of the personnel that you have engaged in any particular task or activity area.
You must ask yourself the question, who are the beneficiaries of a state that is only concerned with law and order and defense? Clearly, those who have money, those who have property, those who are best advantaged are going to benefit from this condition. But there are a lot of people who would not be able to do this. So the welfare state provides this cushion. People who benefit from education and health and all kinds of services of the kind eventually become enabled, full-fledged citizens working with good jobs, paying taxes, and the taxes in turn pay for this welfare condition. When this large number of people exist in that condition, you have the inflammatory material for revolution, for disorder. So it is in the interest of those who are well off, who may advocate the neoliberal state, to have the services of the state, if only to keep happy the large number of people who would otherwise go on the street on a rampage.
Northern Ireland, we had a regulatory regime, right, that was quite strong on equality, but that existed and progressed during a period of economic growth in which it was not seen as a reason for disinvesting or not investing in Northern Ireland, and we had economic growth while having this regulatory regime. I think there's a lesson in that, right, in a global context, that you can do equality, you can do affirmative action, and you can do human rights in a very focused and targeted regulatory way, in a way that is in no way contradictory with having a sustainable model of economic development. And that's an argument that is ongoing, and it's an argument that needs to be won if we're to imagine a different and alternative form of globalization, one that sees a connection between sustainable economic development and equality within societies, and sees that in terms of wins for all sides in a shared and better society.
In a country like Ecuador, similarly in Bolivia, where neoliberalism is no longer the model. In fact, with the new constitutions in both countries, 2008 in Ecuador, beginning of 2009 was passed in Bolivia, both constitutions said what we're doing is leaving neoliberalism behind. We're creating a different model of state, of society, a different social project that's not based on the neoliberal model, but it's based on a new understanding of ourselves as a nation. So that decline in neoliberalism, which one could argue in other places in the world is still present, is on the decline. So what does that mean? Well, it means in a very basic sense that nationalization of industries rather than privatization, right? A better looking within at the resources of a particular country, and also how, in the South, for example, in South America, how can new alliances be built amongst countries so that the dependence doesn't become, again, on the grouping of countries made by the North. But the whole notion of a unified South America today is part of an economic project that challenges neoliberalism. So what does affirmative action look like in a state where neoliberalism maintains itself as the primary policy? And what does it look like in states that not only take distance from neoliberalism, but are rethinking a kind of transformation of a social state project along very different terms that recognizes not just diversity, but recognizes the presence of different nations within the nation, raising very different concerns.
When we're talking about the future, we have to understand that there are many competing conceptions of the future to which people are attached, they're invested in it. Some people are invested in a sense of the future that they would like to have resemble the 18th century. I call those people neoconservatives. The people who would like a 19th century future, I call those neoliberals. Right? It's more like the imperial, they have a sense of a global world, but they maintain a lot of exploitation. A lot of these people don't want to talk about the 20th century sense of the future because that was the age of revolution. And people these days are very afraid of revolution. However, there's a 21st century, 22nd century issue that we have to deal with. And the 21st century, 22nd century issue is that on a planet of 7 billion people, completely interconnected through technology, and with the fact that the sociology of work requires constant movement. In other words, most people work in a different place from where they were born, and their grandchildren will live and work in a different place from where they were born. So once we understand that populations have to flow, immigration, all of these things come into play, what affirmative action faces are several things. The more immediate thing is that we need to, one, make it clear, to take hold of, take responsibility for a more positive language of what affirmative action is.
The irony is that as affirmative action programs are increasingly challenged and being rolled back in the United States, they are expanding in more and more countries in the world.
We are all in this together. And if we want to deal with the global financial crisis and the fact that the economy has not done well, we have to deal with how we reconstruct affirmative action. Affirmative action cannot be for redistribution in terms of business concessions. Affirmative action has to be primarily through education. And if you get education right, then we build people who can be truly independent, and they will stop looking at each other along ethnic lines, but from a completely different perspective, as equal partners in trying to build a nation together.
It is possible to imagine a different way of doing things, and to get there, we have to ask how change happened and whether we can replicate that change, and begin to think, for example, in a broader context, how do we make sure we achieve gender equality? How do we make sure we achieve things for wider society? How do we ensure socioeconomic status doesn't become the biggest impediment to somebody's future progress and mobility in society?
I think we have to become very creative in terms of thinking about other kinds of strategies to ensure exclusion of historically stigmatized and deprived groups is replaced by inclusion.
There is a concern that many people have that we are cutting ourselves up into little fragments. Every little fragment wants representation separately. And where does that leave the idea of India as a civic community? If every citizen begins to see herself or himself as a member of a particular community, then what about what we have in common, what we share as citizens of a civic community?
In the context of Latin America, there has to be a very important collective dimension to any affirmative action policies, without disregarding the individual, the fact that there should also be individual rights at the same time.
Too many of the conversations around law are often very top-down, legalistic conversations. In Northern Ireland, what interests me about that story is a story of communities at a grassroots level, from the bottom up, using the tools and instruments that are there to ensure we try and create a better society, a more participative society. So that's not about academics or lawyers from a top-down perspective telling people what they should do. It's listening to the voices out there and the communities that are organising themselves and using the language to achieve change in a way that attempts to overcome the idea that there are any such thing as second-class persons.
So I think one of the things is the importance of understanding context and what does each one of these contexts afford to a broader view, so that we're beginning to challenge the notion that affirmative action is only quota and policies, is only temporary or compensatory remedies or mechanisms, and that it raises a whole series of other concerns about the model of life that we want to live, and how state itself has to be rethought along very different terms. If it looks at affirming that which has been denied, then yes, it can come as part of state policy, in employment, in education, in the government sphere, but it can also have a strong force in notions of how we do education in a different way. What histories are included, what stories are told that haven't been told, and how are we thinking about the very notion of knowledge as it's connected to life practices. I think those are important things to think about that typically haven't been included in an affirmative action discussion.
Affirmative action can become much more powerful if it is conceived from the perspective of the social movements, for instance, the Afro-descendant and indigenous movements that are struggling for the defense of their cultural difference of the territories. It is from this perspective, I think, that affirmative action policies can be most radically, if I may use that word, conceived. Because if we can say that affirmative action policies can be designed in such a way as to contribute to the self-determination and the autonomy of the groups that these movements represent, then I think we're onto something that is more interesting than just a set of state policies.
The critics of affirmative action, this is the lie they tell. They say we don't need it because they claim we have achieved that. The problem is that's a false thesis. However, in a world in which there is a global federal structure, in which labor, in which ecological issues can be addressed around the planet, in which people always have options, what you do is undermine the capacity to produce vulnerability. And if that happens, if we achieve that, the people who will be most afraid of it, of course, are going to be the people who depend on capital, depend on their wealth, through always having people subordinated and enslaved to losing their employment. So in a shifted world like that, as long as there are constant options, one would undermine the production of vulnerability, and affirmative action, actually, it's one of those rare examples where the goal of affirmative action is to one day be unnecessary for it to disappear. But that goal requires the larger goal of building a better society.
However, it never got implemented. So this past April 2012, Afro-Ecuadorian organizations made a march from the coastal city of Esmeraldas to the highland capital of Quito, over 300 kilometers. People walked for 11 days, demanding the actual implementation and application of affirmative action so that it doesn't just stay at the level of rhetoric or discourse. So seeing a group of people march 300 kilometers across the country in a march that was called a March for Dignity and Life, to argue dignity and life gives a different sense and a meaning to what affirmative action is really about. It's about a very different life project that gives dignity to people, that recognizes people's dignity as humans, as humanity, but that also talks about a new life project that's important, not just for historically excluded groups, but for entire society. What do we understand as life today? Is it life as an individual project? Is it life as consumerism? Or is it a different notion of life, where we live in harmony and integration with other beings that aren't necessarily human beings, that we relate to nature in a different way, and that we create a new notion of coexistence?
We have a lot to be proud of people, our fellow men in society, who are taking on extremely powerful forces, both economic and political. And therein lies hope for change, real change among peoples of the world.